I'm pleased to welcome you all. So many attendants. We are quite impressed and satisfied. But I must hasten to say that this is Richard Lennane's initiative. So he will take whatever you decide, the credit or the blame. And so I'm happy to yield the floor to him because he will run the show from now on. Richard, up to you.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event, and thank you to GCSP for hosting it, and thank you to Hine-Wai also in Control Arms for actually coming up with the idea. So this afternoon, for the next 85 minutes, I guess we were going to be talking about decision-making in disarmament diplomacy, and particularly in a time of COVID-19. Now, if you work in disarmament and arms control in Geneva, you'll know that making decisions is essentially the bread and butter of what we do. Now and again, we actually negotiate a new treaty, but most of our work is about running the treaties and regimes that we already have. And this involves, of course, taking decisions, preparing for decisions, analysing the possible decisions, the means of action, and then actually trying to get agreement on something. Now, these decisions, of course, can be big things, they can be little things, they can be routine administrative things such as the timing of meetings, the schedule of activities, the appointment of office holders, chairs, and coordinators and facilitators, and so on. They can be quite important things, but still administratively focused, like on budget, for example. Financial decisions very much uppermost in many delegations' minds these days. And then, of course, the substantive and political decisions that deal with the actual meat of what the treaty or the regime is intended to do. And these can be things like operational decisions, like, for example, in the Convention on Cluster Munitions or the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention. States parties have to take decisions from time to time on, for example, extension requests for states parties that are not able to meet their deadlines for stockpile destruction or for clearance of contaminated areas. There are other kinds of decisions to set up new processes, to interpret the treaty, to provide guidelines on implementation. We've seen, for example, in the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, sometimes they're quite very big, serious decisions on action plans, on steps towards implementing the treaty, which really set out in some detail what states parties are supposed to do and who is going to do what. So there's a whole range of decisions out there that we, or you, states parties, deal with. And this is perhaps something we should have discussed, given a lot more attention to previously, but it's become, because it's always been an issue, but of course with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become even more complicated. And we've seen a number of meetings and conferences and processes being quite seriously disrupted because the meetings can't be convened, at least can't be convened in person, or they have to be postponed, or they're convened virtually through Zoom or online like this. And that brings up all kinds of difficult questions about how decisions are going to be prepared, how they're going to be discussed, and how they're going to be taken. And there are various approaches that have been tried. Some work better than others, and that's what we want to discuss today. And we hope that we won't be forever in this pandemic situation, that it's eventually going to pass and life will return to something like normal, even in disarmament diplomacy. And then the question is, well, do we just go back to the way things were? Or are the lessons and developments that we've tried out during this strange period that we can adapt and adopt and use into the future? So has the way we deal with decision making in disarmament and arms control, has that changed forever? How and what does it mean for the future? So these are the kinds of things we want to talk about today. It's a discussion, and we're not going to have long presentations or anything, but I'm very pleased we have a compact panel, but that does represent, I think, all the main perspectives. So from the perspectives of governments, we're very pleased to have Ambassador Yann Hwang, the permanent representative of France to the Conference on Disarmament. Ambassador Hwang, as I'm sure many of you know, is very experienced in this field. It's not his first rodeo, we might say. He's been posted in Geneva previously and worked on many of these issues for a long time. So it's a very broad expertise in all aspects of the disarmament enterprise. Also pleased to welcome Alonso Martínez Ruiz from the Permanent Mission of Mexico. Alonso also, I think, is a familiar face to many of us working here on the disarmament diplomacy in Geneva, also a great deal of experience. But I'm pleased to have representatives of two countries, I think, with perhaps, we might say, somewhat different perspectives and priorities for disarmament, so they can give us perhaps slightly contrasting views on the ways that we approach decision-making. Then I'd like to welcome Sheila Mweemba, who's the Director of the Implementation Support Unit for the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Sheila is here under duress, but nevertheless has kindly volunteered to talk to us about what all this means from the Secretariat point of view, from the institutional aspect of running these treaties and regimes. How does an ISU help support decision making? What are the problems thrown up by the pandemic and so on? And finally, Hine-Wai from Control Arms. Control Arms, as many of you know, is a large umbrella coalition of civil society organizations working to control the arms trade, who was instrumental in achieving the Arms Trade Treaty. Hine-Wai is the Geneva representative of Control Arms, and she's here to give us the civil society perspective. And I think we'll see that the COVID-19 pandemic has introduced some particular challenges for civil society participation in decision making. So to kick off, and I'm sure everyone knows the game here with these kinds of Zoom webinars. We'll have a discussion among the panelists. If you have questions as we go along, please type them into the Q&A panel, which you can open by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Type your questions there, and we will pull them out and bring them into the discussion at the appropriate moment. Okay, if everyone's happy, perhaps if I could begin by asking Ambassador Hwang to talk a little bit about decision-making from France's perspective and what he sees are the problems and possibly the solutions. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, GCSP, for inviting me. I don't know if I will provide solutions, but I will clearly present the problems, the problems in plural. I will be short because you want a free discussion, and I think it's better to have this sort of free discussion, and the GCSP webinar is indeed a way to stimulate interactive discussions. So your question is, where are we and what can we do in terms of progressing in disarmament in a COVID context, if I understand correctly, the topic of the day. And I think it's an excellent question. And I think to answer this question, allow me to take a big step aside, if I may, and because we are in a free setting, and to tell my very personal feeling on where we are after 1 year of COVID crisis impacting disarmament. I think perhaps to do so, what we can do is to reflect on what we are doing currently right now, while attending this sort of seminar with a Zoom application. Right now, I'm talking to an audience. I understand that there is 100 people connected, but I can't see their face. I can see only 6 boxes on my screen. I don't know where you are. You don't know where I am. We are not sharing the same space. We are not sharing the same meeting room. We are not sitting around the same table. We are all, at this moment, all of us in different environments, I don't know, perhaps there is some people connected from very remote place, not in Geneva. What do we have in common right now? We have a common digital platform. And this is a major break, not only in the way we work, but in diplomatic and human relations. And I would argue that it is not only a question of working method, but it's a real anthropological break. And this is what I wanted to say. And you have to remember that for hundreds of years, diplomats have always discussed and negotiated in a very delimited and a common physical space. A space that we shared, like the Palais des Nations, like the UN headquarters, or like premises in Vienna, I don't know where, but we had this, common space to discuss and to converse. And we had also in the past, before the COVID crisis, a negotiating table. And a table is not only, what allows us to engage in a dialogue, but is something material, which is something very concrete, which bring us together. And before the COVID crisis, we made this effort to physically transport ourselves to the same place in the Palais des Nations or in the GCSP premises. To say, to illustrate my purpose. So the question is, can the screen, the Zoom, WebEx or whatever, can the screen have the same function? And I think it's not the case. In the French language, screen is écran, and an écran is something which separates people, not unite people. It's something separating people. It has both. It has two meanings. So it is very essential to say that, because I have to say that it's important to keep in mind and to have this conviction that we operate in a very abnormal way and situation. I allow myself to make this digression because it partly answers your question and the question you raised, Richard, at the beginning of this seminar. Can we make progress in disarmament with virtual means? And the question is no, clearly no, because of the reason that I've just mentioned. And what we can do is to make very little progress in terms of process. But when it comes to negotiate substantive issues, it's simply not possible. And some disarmament issues, most of them require difficult negotiation and in-person relationships and diplomatic relationship indeed. And it's not fortuitous that the NPT REFCON, for instance, has been postponed. It's because most state parties in the NPT do think that it's not possible to have a REFCON in a downgrade format, and we need a full-fledged REFCON in order to find solutions to nuclear disarmament, to proliferation, or to some other important issues in this context. It is not also a coincidence that the first committee last year in the UNGA was so poor in terms of results and ended to a sort of rollover of previous years' results, because we didn't have opportunity to meet and to exchange views in person. So the negative impact of this situation is, and I will conclude here to allow the other panelists to provide their views, but the negative impact was, in my view, was on trust and confidence first, because negotiation is all about building trust. And you don't build trust through a screen. That's simply not possible. We are lucky enough that we talk to people that we know. I'm talking to you, Richard. I know you. I know Mark. But imagine that some people, some newcomers, after the COVID crisis, have met people for whom they have never physically met. They have never had a physical meeting with them, and they don't know them, and it's complicated to have a personal relations and a real diplomatic relation with people that you have never met, physically speaking. Second, a negative impact is the inclusivity, and this is very important. With digitalization, there is a problem with multilingualism. Many meetings now take place without any interpretation, and it's not a question of being comfortable with all languages, UN languages translated. It's a question of inclusivity. If you have no translation, then some countries cannot express their views simply. We had last week a WIPA debate through virtual means, of course. And no African countries except South Africa or Namibia took the floor, and because there was no translation at this meeting. So it's very bad in terms of inclusivity, and this is clearly against all basic rule of multilateralism. And last thing, which is very important in terms of negative impact, is the what I would qualify attrition of the debate. I just want to give you an example. My country is the coordinator of the P5. And this is absolutely impossible to exchange views in virtual means within the P5. Because simply we have some confidential elements that is for which it's absolutely impossible to share through virtual means, because of the risk that these confidential discussions could leak in the web. So that's simply not possible. At a certain point, we need to be in a weak-law format or setting, because otherwise it will be too risky. And if we want to build confidence and trust for a certain number of confidential elements or sensitive elements, we need to be within closed doors. So what are we doing now? We are meeting, of course, in Disarmament, but we are meeting through Zoom or WebEx or whatever virtual platform, and we mainly discuss procedural issues. We have spent a year virtually discussing when and how we could work again. It's what we have done for 1 year, basically, to say it frankly. And I think the conclusion that I draw personally from this experience, which is a bad experience, is that we will have to be a bit patient if we want to do quality work and to work efficiently again. And after this COVID crisis, we will have to make a clear distinction between what we can do virtually, and I think once again we can do a few, and we have to be clear that an in-person meeting cannot be replaced by virtual means, and we have to be very careful not to banalize. I don't know if you say that in English. Digital means, which present a lot of limits in terms of negotiations and for being efficient and to make any kind of progress. Happy to be more concrete during the discussion, but I wanted really to say and to explain what is my personal feelings when it comes to be regarding this evolution of e-diplomacy, which something for which I'm very skeptical. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for those very, very thoughtful introductory comments. I particularly like the way you came at this from the point of view of what we're experiencing now is what you described as an anthropological break. It's really a complete shift in the way we conduct diplomacy, after hundreds of years. And the screen as a barrier. I mean, I hadn't thought of that. It's the same in English, of course, but this is a very pertinent point. We think of the screen as a window to talk to each other, but as you say, it is equally in both our languages a barrier, and introduces all kinds of issues of trust and confidence, as you've explained. I think a cynical person might say that we didn't make a lot of progress on disarmament decisions even before the COVID pandemic, but maybe that's something to come back to later in this discussion. Let me turn now to Alonso for another government perspective, perhaps some of the similar points, but maybe something different. Alonso, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Richard. And first of all, I would like to thank both Control Arms and GCSP for the invitation to this event. It is always an honor to be invited to share our views with other diplomats, other stakeholders, the academia on disarmament issues. And particularly, I'm very pleased today because if not, I would be on the CD. So certainly I prefer to be in this forum today. Let me start by sharing what an ambassador told me when I was going to come to take this post. He told me that on the disarmament field, you killed yourself working for not advancing even an inch. So this giving a context of how sometimes disarmament is viewed for the decision-making, as you say, even before COVID. Obviously, if I was pessimistic, I wouldn't have accepted this invitation. But there is a ring of truth in that the disarmament field is an area that in general, results are sporadic in substance and in time. And therein lies for me the importance of the annual, biennial, or quinquennial conferences convened under disarmament and arms race treaty. Just as it happens in the UNGA, with the adoption of resolutions and final reports of special sessions as the SSOD1 that still is the last consensus document that establishes a philosophical understanding of disarmament. They might not necessarily achieve results on the physical destruction of weapons, but they advance the substantive narrative on disarmament and create an acknowledgement of the humanitarian paradigm for achieving it. So I think that's where we feel that the importance of having these meetings. As you have mentioned, there are specific mandates that sometimes treaties contemplate for the conferences or meetings. Let me test that. As one of my mentors and colleagues once told me, Tony Hackes, she had heard, and I'm freelancing because I'm not formally citing her, so any misconstruction falls on my part. Disarmament cannot be seen merely through the absolutist lens of the law of the jungle or the perfectly ordered and disarmed world, but it's more to work for achieving a law in the jungle. And while I had compiled a list of reasons why the conferences are convened, suffice to say at this point that it is the opportunity by states and other stakeholders to make sure that the legal obligations are not death letter, but that they are actually implemented to fulfill its security and/or humanitarian objectives. Obviously, depending on the convention, there are different nature of documents that are adopted, as you have mentioned. And in some instances, apart from the formal decisions, there are also other documents produced that are not formally adopted, like presidential statements, your summaries, etc., but that give some guidance on how the state parties approach the treaty and the possible interpretation that different states give to their obligations. On what might be necessary for good decision making, first and foremost, for good decision, we need a commonality of vision, a convergence of view, a shared political will to see that there is a need for a substantive stock taking of the treaties and an openness to a variety of views and not just an imposition of one's own perspective. While I have identified some concrete fundamentals for sound decision making, probably I could delve deeper into them on the open discussion. However, I just want to mention that we should never operate on the basis that any decisions is a positive result of a conference. Only meaningful decisions with concrete impact towards the strengthening of the regime must be adopted. If not, in the long run, poor decisions might weaken the foundations of the whole edifice. COVID-19 undoubtedly has had a profound impact on the possibility to actually hold conference or how they have been organized. In here, as in almost every other area of disarmament, there are nooks and nuances to each convention that are related to the subject matter, the membership, the obligations itself of each treaty, and whether financial issues or other time-bound decisions need to be decided upon. Suffice to say at this stage that different decisions taken have gone from the supposedly simpler route of postponement to other conventions that have explored or achieved to take decision on their formats different than the tradition. Hybrid or fully virtual meetings, written procedures, or a combination thereof. Some have decided to take the whole gamut of decisions that would correspond under traditional in-person meetings, while others have decided for simpler or more basic decisions with the sole purpose to put, let's say, grease on the machinery, to allow it to continue its most basic work. I think one of what have been the lessons learned is, at this stage of my presentation, I would say that the processes that have worked are those that have understood that special circumstances require special considerations. And this has to be recognized both by delegations and other stakeholders, but also by the chairs of the processes. There has to be a recognition of the context-specific nature of meetings, whether it's a regular MSP or high contracting parties meeting, or if it is a review conference, the types of decisions that need to be approved, whether it requires expert participation from capitals, and all these issues must be adapted to the format of decisions. They must also ensure the participation by all stakeholders. There was an unfortunate experience, for example, in the 6th conference of the ATT, to which the members of civil society justifiably objected that they hadn't been given consideration for their participation when it was organized through a written procedure. There are also cost-related issues. Some of the hybrid meetings that have taken place have benefited from the sponsorship by certain delegations to allow for the virtual option. However, as this wouldn't be expected to be the rule going forward, these types of meetings will have an additional burden on delegations. A clear benefit is that virtual and hybrid meetings allow for a broader participation. Therefore, it has allowed delegates to participate from capitals and from their different permanent missions. It has also opened the door for a broader participation by civil society, as it is not restricted to those either that are based or have the means to cover the travel expenses to Geneva. However, and Ambassador Hwang obviously expressed it very clearly, virtual and hybrid meetings have also brought important and inherent difficulties, particularly when it relates to the negotiations of substantive documents, as it does not allow for person-to-person consultations, informals, and other mechanisms that diplomats have found out to resolve critical issues. Also, another difficulty is obviously the issue of digital divide, on which there is a clear difference of technological access and quality between different states. And there is the challenge to guarantee universal access and participation to the meetings. I had also obviously recognized the issue of multilingualism as one barrier, as most of the virtual meetings do not have interpretation possibilities. I guess I will leave it there to allow time for discussion. And I'm sure that the next steps or what is coming afterwards will certainly be something to be discussed afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alonso, for also a very thought-provoking opening salvo. I thank you also for bringing in this idea of what makes a good decision and what are the ingredients of good decision making, and pointing out again that it's not necessarily a good thing to measure the success of any particular meeting or conference by saying, oh, they reached a decision. It matters, what is the quality of the decision? How does that agreement contribute to more effective implementation of the treaty and so on? So thank you for injecting that very important element. I'm seeing, some themes coming out here, some of the challenges and difficulties, some of which were already in existence and some of which have been amplified by the COVID challenges. But I was also interested in what you said about some of the positive aspects of virtual meetings, that is, expanding access to some extent, that people who are not able to travel are now able to participate in meetings. So that's also something to keep in mind as we go through this discussion. There's going to be pros and cons. But with that, let me turn to Sheila Mweemba now. Sheila, having listened to our two colleagues from government delegations speak about decision-making and some of the challenges, what can you tell us about the viewpoint from someone who has to organize these meetings and support and facilitate delegations in reaching a decision? Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the opportunity to just come and give our side of, this whole scenario. Ambassador Hwang and Alonso have really laid out a lot of the things that we have also observed as the unit that supports states to make sure that the convention progresses. So I'll probably go into how we have been working in the last year. As you know, the Convention on Cluster Munitions is still in its review year, which should have come to an end in November, but couldn't because of some of the issues that have been mentioned by the two previous speakers. The second review conference should have taken place in November, but because of restrictions in how many people can actually physically meet, the convention had to be split into two. Now, what are some of the considerations? The main consideration, of course, is the safety for participants to be able to meet in a safe manner, as well as in line with the federal government's guidelines, which meant that we could not have a meeting of over 100 people. So what do we do? The presidency, with the support of the coordination committee, with the ISU in support, had to look at how do we go forward. Do we postpone the meeting? As you know, a lot of conferences were postponed into 2021. We looked at the calendar. The calendar is really full, and a lot of those meetings may not even take place this year as well. So the decision was taken to split the conference into two. Have part one, which was going to consider, I think as was already mentioned, the kind of procedural matters, the easier decisions to take that would help with the continued operation of the convention, such as the ISU's work plan and budget for 2021, the budget for the following meeting of states parties. Those were going to be considered. And the other consideration was to make sure that the convention doesn't stop. We're kind of, in a space where we're, at least for the CCM, we're kind of in a holding pattern right now. Because the review conference was supposed to have made all these decisions that map out how the convention is going to operate for the next 5 years. We're supposed to close the last 5-year action plan and adopt a new one, which should have happened in Lausanne in November. But here we are. We've only done half of the work because of the reasons that have been raised by the previous speakers. We have not been able to adopt, to take the more serious decisions, if I may use that term. So the second part is where we're supposed to adopt the key documents, and some of these, the 3 key documents that need to be negotiated would be the new action plan, the political declaration, as well as the machinery. How do we go forward? How do we want to see the convention function over the next 5 years? Those decisions have not been taken. And it's been agreed that they will not be taken until a hybrid meeting at least can be held. So we're here. We were supposed to have had this part 2 in February, but we still can't meet physically. So that has now been pushed to June. And we hope that in June we'll be able to conclude this process. But how have we been able to prepare? Because the meetings require a lot of preparation. For these discussions to happen, there are documents that need to be produced. How have we done this? One of the ways is that the president has had to have a lot of informal consultations. We were able to have, a few before it was completely shut down. So we had some informal discussions with delegations on the documents, and a lot of the discussions have had to be done via email. Again, you lose what has been said, the interpersonal interaction. Communication involves body language as well. So we have lost that in this process. Over 50% of communication is body language. How you say it, how, your expression, your gestures, they all convey what it is that you're trying. Sometimes what you say and what you mean are not the same, but your gestures and expressions help, convey that. So that has been lost. And that, I think, has been the biggest loss, in this process. But I think there's a general agreement by states that some progress should be made. What we can handle, let us handle. And so we have, the operational decisions have been taken. You talked about extension requests. Unfortunately, those are time bound. In the first part, submissions were made, discussions were held, but a decision was not taken. It was agreed that these decisions, the granting of extensions would be taken in the second half of the meeting. But then deadlines have come. States had 1st of March deadlines. What do we do? So through silence procedure, these decisions had to be taken for the sake of the convention and for the sake of the states that requested these extensions. Otherwise, they would be found to be non-compliant through no fault of their own. So those decisions have had to be taken. We have another one coming up in May that was not taken because these have to be on exceptional basis. So those will have to be looked at as well now, because the next meeting will be in June. So the convention is progressing slowly, but it's moving. So it's not completely stalled. If I had to, to express in single words how this whole year has been, I would say that we've had to learn to work in a different way. It has challenges, yes, but I think we have learned to adapt. We have had to be flexible. Collaboration has been more important than in the past in order to get, processes going. And I think there's also, we've had to be, to exhibit empathy. I think somebody raised the issue of technological challenges. So a lot of these meetings, one of the options had been to hold the review conference virtually, but that was not a viable option because not all states are able to participate, at the same level. IT challenges are a real thing, and a lot of states cannot, even if they want to. So, but I think at the end of the day, these conventions are resilient. We have managed to continue with implementation. And I think with COVID, the issue of financing was mentioned. But the ISU was able to receive its full budget, covered, had its full budget covered last year. And even this year, it's March, but we're already at 30%, over 30%, just over 30% covered. So I think there's been some good things as well. It has, taught that, we can be creative and we can do things differently. Maybe I should stop there so that I give time to Hine-Wai also, and then I can say some more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. Thank you for that perspective on some of the very practical challenges, and also, as you say, quite a lot of resourcefulness and flexibility shown by all parties in responding to these very difficult circumstances. But it does illustrate, really what we're up against here, and also we do have, with so many postponements, and as you say, we do what we can. What can be done is done in whatever way we can make work. But still, there's a lot of things are being postponed and pushed down the track, and we're going to have to catch up with that somehow. Thanks also for raising the point about body language being an important part of communication. I found myself looking at the camera feed and just sitting up a bit straighter as you said that, rather than slumping. But let's turn now to Hine-Wai. Perhaps Hine-Wai, you can give us some perspectives from civil society. Some of the previous speakers have mentioned some of the challenges, but I'm sure you can go into a bit more detail. Hine-Wai, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Richard. And on behalf of Control Arms, I can say that we very much welcome this opportunity to host with the Geneva Centre on Security Policy this discussion on governance during the time of COVID. And I had prepared 4 pages of my thoughts on good governance and what makes robust decision making, but I will now cast them aside and mainly speak to what has been said. And one thing, in this moment when so many lives have been lost and economies are in free fall, we hear repeatedly that we are in a transformational moment. And I would hope that in such a moment, governments would invest more in reducing inequalities and in global goods. And this would mean taking spending away from other areas. And, I would hope that would be less spending for military and the defence industries. But I am highly sceptical that this will actually prove to be the case in this pandemic. And just another point along these lines, and that is my colleagues, my Control Arms colleagues are currently doing research in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the data is showing that during the pandemic, gender-based violence, domestic violence, violence carried out by gangs and criminal organisations has increased. And, this demonstrates that work under the disarmament treaties, work to limit the arms trade and prevent diversion, this has to continue, even in these very challenging circumstances. And, just continuing along the issue of transformational change and, really coming to some of the points that Ambassador Yann made. And, my first point would be the computer, don't see, the screen is not necessarily a barrier, but it can be your friend. But, I do accept that the operating virtually, it certainly has its challenges, and ultimately it will not be a replacement to in-person meetings, so that when we can, we have to return to in-person meetings. But, I come back to the point that work must continue. And last year we witnessed the member states to the World Health Organization speaking to the issue of COVID, health ministers from around the world speaking from their capitals, and also difficult mandates on the review of the WHO's work, and also the origins of the COVID virus being negotiated. And, I certainly take Sheila's point. Operating at these times takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. But, again, we have to keep this work on track. And, back to the, transformational moment and the challenges that we are faced with. I would have hoped that more efforts would be made by international organisations and also donors to, really ramp up the work on connectivity, especially in the capitals of developing countries. And, this is without a doubt an issue. And, such connectivity not only comes with multiple benefits, but it has the potential to, expose even more delegates to international decision-making processes, more than, what are exposed in the past with expensive flights and hotel reservations to attend international conferences. So, I hope that, really improving connectivity around the world does not prove to be a lost opportunity. And, I take the point about, more effort is needed to facilitate, multilingualism at this moment. We have, despite these challenges, we have seen good processes. And, an example would be the Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, which took decisive action, which, carried out its meetings virtually and dealt with the requests for extensions. And, that's testimony to very well-honed implementation mechanisms, a determination by all delegations to complete clearance and destruction of anti-personnel mines, and really the cooperative spirit that prevails under those under that convention. The BWC and the MPT have postponed their work, and I listened carefully to Sheila about the challenges of a hybrid conference, and that the review conference for the CCM is on hold. One issue is that we don't know really for how long this situation is going to last. We don't know when international travel will return to what it was before the pandemic. So in putting forward plans, office holders and delegations, need to think about not only their plans for this year and next year, and what substantive work can be carried out, what directions can be sent out to states parties and to those operating in the field. Just to take up a couple of examples on what's happened over the past year, and you can read an assessment that was done by Wolf on decision making during the pandemic, and their excellent recommendations. But I'd just briefly like to turn to the ATT and the CCW. And Alonso has spoken about the ATT and what was initially done of not circulating the draft decisions to observer states, to the United Nations organisations, and to civil society. And this was changed due to civil society and control arms and progressive states raising their concerns. But the silence procedure was completed, and a standout decision of that was the decision to establish a diversion exchange forum without any open debate or discussion. And, this is a very unfortunate precedent for inclusivity and the substantial work of a treaty. And then we turn to the CCW, where the work on autonomous weapons, which has been underway for 7 years, and despite developments in autonomous technologies continuing, the process appears to be stalled on endless consultations concerning whether or not a group of governmental experts did or did not take place. For some time, this work on autonomous weapons, there have been concerns about whether it would reach a meaningful outcome. And so, one thing I would say is that disarmament was difficult before the pandemic, it's difficult during the pandemic, and even when we return to in-person meetings, it will still have its challenges. During this time, it's important that, everybody, office holders, those supporting treaty work, such as Sheila, delegations, keep in mind, some fundamental principles of good decision making, and that is transparency and inclusivity, that all stakeholders need to be able to express a view on decisions before those decisions are taken to states parties. And they also, everybody needs to be aware of how decisions are taken and the role that governance can play in the health and, future sustainability of a treaty system. Even in these difficult times, important work can be done to keep these processes on track and to keep things moving forward. So I'll leave it there, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hine-Wai. That's some excellent thoughts in there, which actually leads us on very nicely to the next sort of section of discussion I wanted to open up. But thank you for raising, some of the particular concerns and giving some specific examples, because I think that does help to focus our discussions and keep us looking at what concrete differences there are and how things might change or what we might need to do differently in future. As you say, it's very difficult not knowing when exactly things are going to go back to normal, if they ever do. But I was interested, particularly in what you said about some treaties actually doing very well, and you mentioned the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, and that meeting had been run very well, given the difficulties, and that the necessary decisions had been taken. And you mentioned that perhaps by way of explanation, that was due to it being a very kind of cohesive body anyway. So I'm wondering if it's reasonable to conclude that the difficulties thrown up by the pandemic tend to amplify the existing atmosphere, if you like. That is, treaties where you have a lot of commonality already and decisions being taken smoothly, and a lot of generally a high level of background consensus, if we can put it like that, have done better than treaties which are dealing with a lot of disagreements and diverging priorities, and that's only been made worse by the kinds of constraints we've been discussing.